Hey YouTube, Wicked here, and today I want to talk about one of my favorite characters in Genshin Impact, Tartaglia, also known as Childe. With his upcoming banner rerun, I want to talk about his kit, his playstyle, why he's such a great character, and why you should pull for him if you're looking for a Hydro DPS character. Now, while this kit is fairly simple to use, there are a lot of nuances that I want to cover to make sure that you understand his abilities to get the most out of this great character. First and foremost, he is such an extremely fun character to play. Even though he's a bow user, his elemental skill swaps his bow for double daggers and puts him into a melee stance. Not only does it do damage upon using the skill, it gives you a 30-second window in which you can use these daggers to deal full-on melee hydro damage. It should be noted that in this melee stance, Childe cannot do a plunging attack, so just keep that in mind to stay grounded when attacking with him in this mode. The cooldown of his elemental skill does scale depending on how long you use it, which can range anywhere from about 5 seconds to a total of 60 seconds if you use it for the full duration. To get the best use out of it, I would highly recommend not letting the timer run out on his elemental skill, as this will keep him in a major downtime until his elemental skill returns. Now, the first thing you need to know about Childe is the debuff he applies to enemies called Riptide. There are two ways to apply Riptide. The first way is the more annoying way, and that is by using a charge shot on the enemy. While this is kind of alright if you're fighting a larger enemy, it's kind of rough to deal with when you're attacking multiple targets at the same time. The better way to apply Riptide is in his melee stance. His level 70 passive, Sword of Torrents, lets you apply Riptide on any enemy when a critical strike is triggered with your melee attacks. You will know which enemy has Riptide by the large blue icon that appears on them. This debuff lasts 10 seconds and is the key to deal large amounts of AoE hydro damage with Childe. You see, whenever Childe attacks an enemy with Riptide, different effects take place depending on what attack you use to trigger it. If you attack an enemy with your charged arrow, 3 additional instances of AoE hydro damage are applied to the enemy. This is known as Riptide Flash. This can happen once every 0.7 seconds and is considered normal attack damage. If you attack an enemy with your melee stance attacks, Riptide Slash is triggered. This deals AoE hydro damage around the enemy and can only happen once every 1.5 seconds. Though this is considered as elemental skill damage, and as such scales off his elemental skill talent. And lastly, if you defeat an enemy with a Riptide marker, an explosive Hydro AoE is triggered, which also applies Riptide to any enemies who get hit by it. This is called Riptide Burst. There's no cooldown on this, so multiple Riptide bursts can happen at the same time when multiple enemies go down. Managing these skills and knowing how to apply them or how they proc, while easy, is key to performing well with Childe. Moving on to his burst skill, depending on what stance he's in, a different burst is triggered. In range, his burst is called Flash of Havoc. This throws a large, long-distance AoE that not only triggers Riptide on the enemy's hit, but returns a third of the energy used for the burst itself. In melee, his burst is called Light of Obliteration. He performs a large AoE attack around himself, dealing massive hydro damage, and can trigger Riptide Blast. Riptide Blast triggers when using his burst skill on enemies affected by Riptide. It will clear the Riptide status and trigger an AoE Hydro Explosion. Damage dealt is considered burst damage and plays heavily into a build I will discuss a little bit later. The damage of his various burst skills are very high. His melee burst does do more damage than the ranged one, but the ranged one is, well, ranged and provides an energy refund. So use it however you wish, they both scale really well and has a good portion of damage to his kit. Either of these bursts share the same 15-second cooldown. His utility passive lets him increase the level of the normal attack talent for your entire party by 1. While this might seem decent, it's actually one of the better utility talents in the game. Not only does it make your entire team's normal attack hit harder, but it can save you valuable time and resources as you progress throughout the game by increasing the skill level to someone that would normally require you to use something such as a rare Crown of Insight. Moving on to his Constellations, Childe performs really well at C0, so for free-to-play players, he's an outstanding Hydro DPS character without much power locked behind Constellations. That being said, his Constellations do unlock some quality of life upgrades that could be beneficial if you're planning on grabbing more copies of him this time around. His C1 decreases the cooldown of his elemental skill by 20%. This is actually pretty useful in being able to use him a bit more freely and frequently. It isn't really necessary if you can time manage your team properly, but it does help in the cases you can't or forget. It will lower the max cooldown to 45 seconds. His C2 provides an energy charge of 4 energy whenever an enemy with Riptide dies. This is actually pretty good in gaining energy, especially when dealing with a bunch of mobs, and lets you use his burst a little more frequently. There are ways to get back a lot of energy for Childe in his downtime depending on the team or how you play him. So this sometimes doesn't really make too much of a difference, but it definitely does help if you're being lazy about it or if you're using him as a solo hydro unit in the team. His C4 is actually pretty amazing. As long as he's in melee stance, a Riptide slash is triggered on enemies every 4 seconds if they are affected by Riptide. If not, a Riptide flash is triggered, which, as mentioned previously, applies Riptide, and then follows the same conditions in triggering Riptide slashes every 4 seconds. What's really crazy about this constellation is that they aren't subjected to the same cooldowns that they're normally subjected to. They can activate freely and independently of actually manually triggering these effects, which honestly really gives them a nice spike in damage. And lastly, his C6 turns him into a solo DPS machine by letting him reset his elemental skill when you trigger his burst, essentially bypassing his cooldown and allowing you to leave him on the field indefinitely as long as he has his burst reapplied. In my opinion, his C1 and C2 are merely convenience constellations, whereas his C4 and C6 really improve his kit, damage, and allow for various other methods of play and team compositions. Another thing that I like about Childe is that you can pretty much use him in any type of team, and this is why he's such a great character. My preference is to run him in a duo DPS setup. This means that I will share field time between Tartaglia and another main DPS to avoid cooldown times. This works especially well with someone such as Raiden Shogun, as their elemental skill further increases Childe's DPS while he's on the field, while letting him cool down when it's time to use her burst. Another good character I like to use him with is Diluc. Because of Diluc's low cooldowns, it's easy to trigger and re-trigger elemental reactions while keeping them off the field during cooldowns and out of each other's way. With this setup, I then usually like to use someone who provides support damage in the third party slot. Now this can be anyone such as Zhangling, Xingqiu, Fischl, but my most used preference is Zhongli, as not only does he provide a shield to give Childe the freedom to attack as he pleases, but also provides support damage through his pillars, as well as providing a damage buff through the Millilith set and his natural resistance down procs. As for the last character slot, I usually run Bennett, usually for his massive attack increases and healing when needed. Now, while this is usually the setup that I run, honestly you can pretty much run him with whatever you want. Though I will say that I would kind of advise against running Childe as a solo DPS, unless you have him at C6, as this will normally leave you with a lot of downtime and nothing to do while waiting for a long cooldown for Childe's elemental skill to come back. In regards to his build, there's really only 5 weapons that I would recommend. While 2 of these bows are 5 stars, one of them is kind of out of reach until a rerun. First 5-star weapon being the rarest, the Thundering Pulse. This gives his normal attacks massive amounts of damage, as well as having a high base attack. I'm pretty sure this is the current best in slot for him, as the damage gains from it are ridiculously high, but there are other options as I don't ever recommend pulling on the weapon banner anyways. A less rare, but still rare bow, the Skyward Harp. This provides you with a decent crit rate, a bonus to crit damage, as well as an additional AoE attack that deals physical damage every 4 seconds at Refinement 1. Moving on to more free-to-play options though, there's really only 3 bows to kind of recommend here. Firstly, Rust. This is kind of like a mini Thundering Pulse. It provides a pretty huge damage increase to his normal attacks, which do work on his melee stance normal attacks. Also, seeing as this is a 4-star weapon, it's much easier to get refinements on, which can provide you with an up to 80% increase in normal attack damage. This is actually pretty huge, and as long as you can cover your crit chance and crit damage stats through other means, this is a great and probably best 4-star weapon for Childe. A more niche but super fun weapon would be the Battle Pass bow, the Viridescent Hunt. This provides you with a crit rate bonus as well as an additional instance of damage over time, which is actually pretty decently strong if your Childe has a high attack stat. What makes this bow super cool though is that it creates a small cyclone every 14 seconds that pulls enemies in, making it easy to apply Riptide, trigger Riptide bursts, and ensure you hit multiple enemies with Riptide slashes. And lastly, the only other bow I would recommend here is the Stringless. Now, I wouldn't really use this normally, as firstly it has an elemental mastery bonus and requires you to trigger elemental reactions to really benefit from it, though this also doesn't affect his attacks in melee stance, meaning you'll only use this on a burst build where you are only using him for the burst. So this weapon, paired with an Emblem of Severed Fate set, gives you a massive increase in damage to his burst skill, which, while already massive, lets you hit insane numbers if you are looking to use him that way. They did also show the new bow that's releasing the Polar Star. I personally think that this weapon is a little overhyped. Sure, it gives a lot of stats, gives a decent bonus to elemental skill and burst, but in the end it just gives attack, and I personally don't recommend wasting your primo gems for this weapon and just wait for something that's even better to come along. You could use 4 stars and you'll get by with them. When it comes to sets, there aren't really too many options here that beat his main set, the Heart of Depth. This provides him with a Hydro damage bonus as well as increasing his normal and charge attack damage by 30%, which is great for his kit if you're using him in a solo or duo DPS setup. You could use an Emblem of Severed Fate as mentioned previously if you are exclusively using him for his bursts and large numbers, though it does make him a bit more niche in his gameplay. Alternatively, you can go the other way around and use a Shiminawa set, which does give him a slightly larger increase in damage to his normal attacks, though it does take energy away from his high damage burst. I'd say it's a good alternative if you don't have a decent Heart of Depth set, but overall I think Heart of Depth is the best set you can put on him. As for stats, depending on how you want to use him, his best stats would be an Attack Sands, a Hydro Cup, and crit damage circlet, but if you're feeling a little experimental and have really good artifacts, you can use an energy recharge sands or even a crit rate circlet depending on the weapon you are using. Overall, I think Childe is a great addition to any team, and while you won't really see any massively large numbers outside of his burst, he attacks really quickly, and with all the various ways his abilities trigger, you will see your screen fill up with a bunch of numbers, which makes it really super satisfying to play. And whenever someone gets out of reach, swap to your bow and take them out with a flash. Either way, let me know in the comments below what you plan on doing for Childe. Are you pulling for him? What are you excited about with the upcoming 2.2 banners? And how do you plan on spending or saving your primo gems? As usual, like and subscribe if you'd like to see more guides and videos. You can also follow me on twitch.tv/wickedsent. See y'all later.